I changed the aperture a little bit, still looking at BPM 2020, not so much consistently the 5-year horizon, but what's happening over the next 3 to 4 years, and what was the starting point last time? Well, last time we talked about the story of young Benjamin who got into his Alfa Romeo boat-tail Spider, drove up to Santa Barbara, interrupted the wedding, banging on there. I can't remember the woman's name, maybe it was Heather. But what was that poignant advice that he got before that? What really kind of made it into the vernacular of understanding what happened over the course of the second half of the 20th century. That's right, a word that starts with P, just one word, process. And in reality, plastics clearly redefined and made industry, enabled the consumer revolution of the 20th century. So for the 21st century, as we move away from a dematerialization of the economy, ultimately what's driving it, one way is to look at it and say software. But what is software other than a means for conveying digitized process? So what's defining the economy of the 21st century is process. And I used an example last year of, for the disruptive companies, the digital disruptors of Tesla being a great example of that, looking at the market cap trajectory of Tesla growing far faster than its competitors. How did that play out from last year's perspective? Tesla's doing pretty well. For whatever reason, I was invested in Ford, but Tesla has done pretty well. Now exceeding Ford and probably going to overtake GM. Tesla is in the car business, but what is the product that it sells? How is it run as a company? It's a software company selling a software product. And in fact, for digital disruptors, what is the defining difference for them is software, and what they're doing is BPM. Now, do they build their business on a BPMS? Actually, in some cases, not necessarily these brands, but what they're doing, their differentiation is what we call BPM. The fact that they haven't invested in a BPMS to build that business, that's our marketing challenge. That's not a technical challenge or a functional challenge. We didn't miss the mark because the BPM platform is the platform to build these companies. Just in most cases, they hired a bunch of programmers out of college and built their own. But what they're doing is BPM. Our challenge is to make that the BPM industry. And ultimately, that is what we're doing in terms of how we're enabling companies to transform. So there was another prediction last year that I made, and I introduced a concept that I've held to and would still hold to. But I would ask, how did it hold up, and did you even remember it? So I said that the 3 R's are what's going to define BPM last year, 2016, 2017, and beyond. And the 3 R's are robots, rules, and relationships. So the robot part stuck. I think that the rules part, and again, chatbots, decisions, and cognitive isn't quite as alliterative as robots, rules, and relationships, so I wanted to stick with the 3 R's. But of these 3 R's, the one that is perhaps most pronounced is the impact of decisions on the BPM industry and how that's shaping both how we leverage the technology and how the technology itself, how the platforms are evolving. And that's going to define a lot of what we're going to talk about today. It's going to define my presentation later and even later in this presentation. But the robots is the other one that stands out, is more memorable, because robots really have been top of mind lately, and for a couple of reasons. One, the general notion about the disruptive and in some cases scary context of robotic automation, but also what's happened in the last 12 months or so with the evolution of RPA. So kind of out of nowhere, but not really out of nowhere, because we can kind of have a pretty clear trace on what are the technologies, what are the drivers behind RPA. But all of a sudden this became a pretty important catchphrase and point of interest in in the industry, around BPM. In preparation for this, wanted to look at some things. Does anybody use Google Trends? Neil? The really smart people in the room use Google Trends. So, is Google Trends accurate? Well, Google has basically one source of revenue. And that's not just the monetization of search, but it's understanding the movement in the popularity and the ability to capitalize on the difference in that movement around search phrases. Google Trends analyzes the move of search phrases. So in this case, 100 is the peak interest at the moment in time, the day and time in which people were searching for that particular phrase. You can do it based on concept of other things. Google has a semantic understanding where you can put in RPA as a concept. You can't for RPA, but for other concepts you could. In this case, I'm more interested in the search phrase. What's happening with interest around RPA? So we see clearly quite a bit of growth. As soon as we got my presentation on YouTube, it spiked. Dropped, spiked, dropped. That's kind of an interesting thing. Is it accurate? Absolutely. I mean, Google has bet one of the largest businesses in the world, a multi-billion-dollar business, on the precision around this. So that happened. I can't explain that. But clearly, in the last week, there was a major drop-off. That actually represents just the last week. I think that we'll see a spike back up. I think that we're going to continue a trend going up. But there's also a couple of nuances to this. That's the worldwide view. So what's the worldwide, where's the center of interest around RPA when you look at the worldwide view? It's pretty concentrated. And kind of makes sense when you look at RPA as being seen as not just a proxy, but the way that you're going to stay in the game of BPO when the model shifts away from wage arbitrage to automation. When we change this, so it's not just in India where there's interest in RPA. Clearly, there's a burgeoning market in the US, in Europe. I'm going to show RPA that I'm using today, after lunch. But when we change the aperture and add two things. First is to continue on the worldwide search and add BPM and see how that adds up. And again, this is the search phrase for business process management. Not BPM as a search phrase for obvious reasons, but over the last 5 years, what do we see with business process management as a search phrase? Pretty consistent. Clearly, nobody cares about BPM at Christmas, but the trend line, pretty consistent. Also a drop there. That's the worldwide view. When we take that just to the United States, it normalizes a bit. Still in the US, people care even less about BPM at Christmas, and we don't see the big drop. We also see a slightly wider split. So we don't have anywhere near as much interest in RPA as BPM. And I expect that to continue, and I really believe, and we'll continue to talk about this and we'll continue to see this today, that RPA, very conveniently as shown here, is indeed a subset of the mission of the industry of BPM, not something that's going to overtake it. And based on the regression lines here, you wouldn't see it overtaking it anytime soon. What about digital transformation? Isn't that completely taking away BPM? Well, that's actually pretty interesting. If you look at, it's absolutely paralleling, but digital transformation also sees a drop. Something's happened in the last week, so it'll be interesting to see in a couple of weeks as these stats add up. But clearly, digital transformation is starting to parallel in level of interest, in the velocity around the topic, business process management, but really didn't overtake it. When we were here last year having this conversation saying, who cares about BPM? It's all about digital transformation. In the US, and the worldwide split is even slightly greater because this is a more US-centric term. That really wasn't the case. We're still seeing it now very much in parallel, but hasn't grossly overtaken it. And a last couple of points on here. This next one, Bruce won't even believe. I'm sorry. Well, this is when we look at it just in the context of 2 years, there we see, again, or 1 year rather, we see it being, interest fairly parallel. We do see this dip that we did not see in interest for BPM. We see this dip in digital transformation. That, frankly, I would believe. Because there is certainly an ebb and flow around trendier terms, business process management, as we saw in the previous slide. The stability around interest in that is clear. This is the one, I think, that Bruce will not believe. Just adding BPMN to the mix. So wouldn't you think BPMN, there would be an enormous gap? And this is something I watch pretty consistently. There is a gap. There are moments where the gap is pretty wide, but overall we still see a real sustained interest around BPMN. I use BPMN as a search term to be consistent here, but BPMN is one that actually has a concept cluster around it in Google Analytics or Google Trends, where you can see actual validated interest. They call it properly the business process model and notation concept cluster. So it's interest specifically around BPMN. Man, it's not, there's a point in time a couple of years ago where it was, actually, no, I'm sorry, this is just the 12 months. But if you look at it, you'll look at the 5-year view, you'll see there were moments where BPMN was a little trendier than it is today, but you still see the sustained interest. So the last point, the reason why you don't use, in this context, BPMN as a search term, it just so grossly outstrips everything else. I don't know what the hell was happening New Year's of this year, where there's this big spike and it doubled. But clearly, BPMN as a search term is inclusive of a lot of different things. However, when we think about the market that we're trying to reach, when they're looking for us, do they take the time to spell out business process management, or are they actually looking at it as, BPMN the way we would? This is bpmNEXT, not business process management next. So actually, we are losing some of that activity by focusing just on that business process management. We know what we mean by that. Here, it's inclusive of electronic dance music and lots of other things that have nothing to do with our industry, but we can see quite a bit of interest. So the momentum of interest around the market is still hot. Robots, though, still fascinated by them. One of the things that we had talked about last year was the notion of things like Amazon Echo and how important that's going to be to BPM, which they're probably not an obvious connection. And is Amazon Echo a robot? That's a good question. Who thinks yes? There we go. Some interest. So I think it is, and specifically in this context, that there are lots of things, and when we think about robots as they relate to our business and our processes, the robot is an interface. And what we're seeing now, and what we were beginning to see, certainly this has happened before last year, but really we hit an inflection point in the evolution of humankind last year, where we have this Cambrian explosion now underway of all kinds of digital things entering our lives, the workplace, our homes. And ultimately, all of these things are interfaces from the standpoint of our processes in particular. And that is radically changing all of software, certainly all of BPM. And when we think about how we're going to interact with our customers, our employees, it's not going to be through the work list metaphor that's defined BPM as a defined workflow, as a defined MRP that goes back to an early 19th century model for how you are managing the shop floor. Basically, the same metaphor has carried through, like Roman roads being paved and defining the width of cars. And we need to break away from this as we go through what is truly a disruption. And a big part of that is removing the distinction between what supports the task and the task itself. So this is something that I'd introduced last year. I'd stolen it from other analysts, but tried to give it a little more context as they were talking about the way that software architecture had evolved. And we went through, and luckily, BPM was kind of on the beginning stage as it evolved of the shift from two-tier to an N-tier, or really a three-tier architecture. And that was pretty important about how we understood and explained the way that BPM worked. But it's created legacy for a lot of, certainly installation, certainly also the way that products are built today, and that we need to move towards, this is the part that I stole, this notion of four-tier. Frankly, putting a number in front of the tiers may not be as important. It's just understanding that abstraction between where we're putting the logic for how things work and separating that to having a separate layer to understand that tasks have different meaning and different behavior depending on how that interaction is occurring. It's not enough just to have a mobile representation and a web representation, but we really need to completely abstract the way that we're going to interact with this work, the way that the work is going to be done from the logic and the decisions behind it. An example of this and what this means from an architecture standpoint. Has anybody looked at this? It's specific to cities. I don't know, Neil, have you looked at the London version of DoNotPay.com, which is positioned as the world's first robot lawyer? So what this is a free, fairly cheap AI engine where you put in your information, and they have it in London for parking tickets, and maybe more in the UK, but in New York, they have it for more, or they have it for basic legal things, in particular around rent disputes. So you put in your information, and it basically fights your case for you. How does it do that? Well, it generates the responses and knows what to do, but as on one hand, we're digitizing the front end of how we interact with processes. Cities are investing great money in making it easy to pay your parking ticket, or to protest your parking ticket, or to report a violation if you as a tenant feel that you were wrongfully evicted. We're trying to break down the barriers for a human being to be able to do that. In the process, we're making it very easy for a machine to do that, but you need the machine to know how to do that. Well, now as we apply AI to that, we have infinite scalability, and we're going to need an army of robot lawyers to combat an army of robot lawyers for every transaction that we do. If you're a bank and you're writing mortgages, and you have reams of laws, and I know a little bit about this just from my own work. There are some states, some counties where some legislator passed an innocuous little law that no lawyer's ever heard of, that completely invalidates the mortgage if it was done on a Tuesday and it was raining, or very obscure circumstances that get pushed through. Our business has existed on the basis that human beings don't have the capacity to worry about all that stuff, that there's a utility curve in which it doesn't make sense to bother with these sorts of details. Robots don't care about that utility curve. They have infinite scalability. So imagine every single transaction that you do now being reviewed by an army of robot lawyers. So how are you going to keep your business intact? How are we going to survive and actually have functioning systems? So this is where we need automation, decision management, and BPM. This is where we're building our businesses on the basis of these building blocks. So what does this look like? I had offered a picture of this last year. I said it was guaranteed future-proof for 5 years, and that was the model that I had set up. Future-proof, did we get a full 5-year lifespan out of this? Well, I did make some tweaks. So this is what I'm suggesting is probably still guaranteed. I'd love to crowdsource this picture and have a little more specifics and clarity to it. Obviously, this is fairly high level. But I do believe, absolutely, in fact, not only do I believe that this is what you need, and I have maintained that this isn't a whole product strategy. This is not the classic vendor or analyst checklist to vendors saying, if you don't have this, then you don't have a BPMS, or you don't have a smart enterprise suite, or you don't have whatever. This is what I'm saying. This is the platform on which we need to be building our businesses. Not coincidentally, this is what's starting to take shape from the standpoint of BPMS vendors and what they're adding to it. Appian World last week or the week prior just happened to mention that all of these things are now in their BPMS. Are they really? That's something that's worth talking about over the course of this week. I don't think any vendor has or needs to offer all of these components as a single suite. I still think that our focus on standards, on interoperability, and the value of best of breed means that as we pull these together, particularly as we're going to see in presentations around the benefit of open source and how that has been expanding, how that can augment other platforms. But for the basic pieces, process management and decision management existing together as distinct but critical first-class citizens of the suite. The event processing, when I had first envisioned that, it had event capture as more of a middleware tier that's being fed into these components that are operating here, including a event processing system. I think that machine learning, its greatest value to business computing is in this context of complex event processing. We still need the means to get it in there. So that this middleware tier probably needs to be redefined, but it's bringing that into, in fact, we're going to see some demonstrations about that, bringing that into a machine learning context. And that goal-driven, which was a valuable but fairly rare capability in the BPMS platform. We've seen some demos over the last 5 years where there was a formalized goal-seeking, goal optimization capability. I still see value in that. I think that ultimately what we're talking about there is a tier of automation defined by RPA and cognitive, which are distinct, but in both cases that are driving towards the realization of established goals. Goals expressed as rules and parameters and decision logic. This is the piece that I would want to really refine from my standpoint over the course of this week. So again, I'd really welcome input. I saw some people take pictures of this. I would love to end this event with a common understanding of what it is that we're talking about that defines the BPM landscape today. And while some would say, well, there's so many things on there that are not BPM, I disagree. I say that BPM is all of these things, even though it's the coalescence of otherwise separate capabilities that are coming together. So, what does the next 4 years have in store for BPM? I would sum it up conveniently in a 4-letter acronym. Forget the 3-letter acronyms. A 4-letter acronym. MAGA. So, I'm going to end on this last point about Drucker. Whenever I'm doing an event, I think about Peter Drucker. If some of you that attended my events in the late 90s, early 2000 timeframe, had a chance to interact with Peter Drucker, and that was one of the highlights of my career, having that relationship with Drucker, which revolved around getting him to my events, but because he's not somebody that was particularly mobile, he appreciated somebody working with him. So he and I developed a friendship. I would drive him around, do errands, and we would just talk. And there were a couple of things on the topic of predictions. He was famous for not making predictions, not really going into it. And at one of our events, he and I were seated together on stage, and this was an event kind of like this, in that we were really looking, it was in 2000, or 99 or 2000, but it was in that moment where everything seemed possible. But we wanted to know, with the wisdom of somebody like Peter Drucker, what does the future hold for us? And he gives very thoughtful, long answers, and he was explaining that the last prediction he ever made was at the beginning of his career, and he was asked about the stock market, and he said, I see that the stock market is stable, should continue into the next year unabated, and I expect basically good things for the stock market. That was the beginning of 1933, or 1939 rather, or the stock market crash. So he says, never again does he do predictions. But he said this quote, maybe, and he said something to me privately that stuck with me and was kind of uncharacteristic of me as we're talking, and he said, I'm glad I don't live in your time. And he said, in my time, success was easy. Nobody had real expectations around success. Now, everybody expects to be a millionaire, everybody expects to be success. You cannot be happy. I would not want to live like that. And I said, okay, I'm with you on that. That is a reasonable point. Last year, we talked kind of from that perspective as we were envious of what's happening everywhere but BPM. We were envious of and trying to reposition around, well, it's around low-code stuff, stuff that's cheaper, stuff that's arguably easier. It's around these things. But as we look at what's happening, there's no place I would rather be than in the BPM industry and where it's going. The question is, where are we taking it? And to Drucker's point, the best way to make that prediction about where BPM is going is to invent that vision, to invent that picture. So I'm going to end on that point and say, let's do it. Thank you.